Where are we going right now?
We are heading up to see the Brown Mountain Lights. Well, hopefully see the Brown Mountain Lights. We are in North Carolina. And the Brown Mountain Lights is a phenomena that has been seen since basically man could speak about them. And we are actually here in a peak point of the year. So we are really crossing our fingers and toes that we actually will not only be able to see them, but capture them on film for ourselves.
Earth lights, orbs, spook lights, whatever you want to call them. Nearly every place on Earth has some sort of legend revolving around mysterious nighttime illuminations. Unlike the typical UAP descriptions, however, these glowing objects tend to be seen close to the ground, and they seem to gravitate to one geographical area. Places like Brown Mountain or Joplin, Missouri, have a history of these phantom lights that goes back centuries, and are so commonly witnessed that even scientists have spent decades trying to get at a root cause for them. If a UFO is simply an unidentified flying object, then the subject encompasses a number of folkloric elements that often get overlooked, and mystery lights are one of them. These orbs are an ancient, observable phenomenon that falls just outside the boundaries of the topic. But that's the thing about me. I'm not a fan of labels, and the longer I look into various Fortean subjects, the more I begin to wonder if they aren't all connected to begin with. Who am I to leave something like spook lights out of the discussion? So what can we learn from these strange lights, and how do they play a role in the UFO topic as a whole?
Spook lights are a tradition usually attributable to small town folklore related to like lovers' lanes.
Michael Huntington is a UFO enthusiast and blogger who takes a scientific, skeptical approach to the subject of ufology. He also loves to celebrate the bizarre topics he has studied for most of his life by cataloging unusual legends, folklore, and places around the United States, and you're unlikely to find anyone more knowledgeable about small-town legends and lore.
Generally, the story of spook lights is, there's a rural road where something occurred, like maybe an Indian princess committed suicide, or a rail worker had been beheaded, and he's looking for his lost head after some accident. So traditionally, spook lights have been ghost stories.
So there are several theories for the origins of the spook lights. One of the ones that you find throughout the different places where the spook lights are seen are that they're attributed to a Native American legend, particularly very often the death of either a pair of lovers or the death of a woman who was betrothed to a Native American man. For example, the Oklahoma spook lights are often attributed to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans were killed as the result of that march. So these moments of death are what lead to these lights being seen in the night sky as a continuing tribute to the Native American peoples.
If you take it just as it is, it's a UFO phenomena. It's an unidentified aerial phenomena in that spook lights are generally described as glowing balls of light, usually about basketball size, generally white, sometimes they're amber. I guess some people would describe them as orbs, but we're not talking orbs from like photographs. We're talking objects that move around, that are illuminated, that interact with the environment, will disappear if lights get shown upon them, will cause automobiles, their electronics to be interfered with.
When you start talking about spook lights and earth lights, then you have to begin reckoning with lobes, balls of light, the orbs that are typically talked about today, various sizes and colors, but that seem to defy the normal laws of physics regarding electricity or lightning, for example.
They're described as lights in the night sky that move around, that seem to dance. They can join together or split up. They can change colors. They move around really drastically, picking up speed, slowing down, really moving at speeds that are not capably understood by most of today's contemporary aircraft. And the frequency by which they're sighted also undermines the idea that they are contemporary aircraft, because what type of maneuvers would occur almost every night?
Spook lights have been around forever. and they've been recorded ever since people have decided to write down histories.
So some of the places that have a variety of UFO or unexplainable light stories related to them are often referred to as areas where spook lights or orbs occur, because in fact what they are unexplainable lights that occur over various regions. So for example, Brown Mountain, as well as US 181 in Oklahoma and Marfa, Texas. All of these places are home to the spook lights among some others, but these are some of the really famous ones.
They've taken a variety of forms. I think there are various categories of mysterious lights. The bottom line is that various times and places, people have seen lights either in the sky or lights in close proximity to them. In some cases, even entering their own dwellings, entering into vehicles that they're in, seen along ridge lines, mountainous areas, along railroad tracks. Whatever is being seen has the property of being a light, typically in a dark place.
In Oklahoma, they're called the Hornet lights, and what they look like are lights in a variety of colors that appear in the night sky. They're often attributed to driver's headlights or to campfires in the place of Marfa. However, that's been pretty heavily debunked because these places have such a variety of reports throughout history. I mean, some of these reports go back to the 19th century, so it's really hard to accredit them to contemporary technologies when they have such a historical presence.
You can look at folklore of the past, and there are many parallels at the very least, going all the way back to things like mystery lights, spook lights, will-o'-the-wisps, going far back into European folklore. There have been countless stories about don't follow the lights into the woods or something bad may happen to you.
Matthew Shang grew up in the town of Asheville, New York, in Chautauqua County. Asheville's mysterious lights haven't gained the same sort of prominence that areas like Marfa or Brown Mountain have, but that doesn't mean anything to those who've witnessed them. What makes Matt an especially useful witness is that his sighting wasn't simply of an illumination glimpsed at a distance.
So in the town of Asheville, which is in New York, Western New York, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. Mass UFO sightings, ghost stories. People were seeing mystery lights, like just giant spheres. I've heard people talk from like 1 foot to 5 feet in diameter. It's very isolated. There's like you feel very isolated in that town, and it's only like 1,000 people. So I would take night hikes with my friend anytime it was nice out. So what we would do is we would start at like 9 o'clock and then pick a direction and hike. And we would go until we just got tired, really. You know, we hiked maybe 5 miles and hit this field. And we were gonna set up in the field, but decided against it and broke through the tree line on the other side and continued hiking into the forest again. We went underneath the horse fence. Soon after that, we saw a soft blue light in the distance, and we thought that it was a person, because there are backwoods people in Asheville that they stay to themselves. This light kind of was just getting closer and closer, and it was kind of just like waving back and forth, kind of going in a zigzag motion. It got maybe 25 feet in front of me, and it was maybe 3 feet in diameter. It was just like a ball of energy, and it was very like soft, darker towards the center, and it would get bright and go out, and then it'd go out like that, and it just did this like ring thing. The closer it got, I kind of fell into this like dream state. I remember looking and seeing my friend, and he was in the same kind of state. He was just kind of like in awe, and I like snapped out of it. And I started saying that we need to go, because my body was just like, yep, now it's time to run. Both of our adrenalines were pumping. We were running, and we hit a farmer's plot eventually. We waited till sunrise and just kind of waited on his land, and then asked him where we were. And we actually ended up in the town over from us. We just kept running. And so we walked home after that.
Will-o'-wisps might be one of the oldest examples of a UAP. They were seen quite frequently around the moors and bogs of England, and were typically said to be simply a floating light. By the time the first settlers began setting down roots in the Americas, they were almost immediately recounting sightings of lights moving through the forests and across prairies of the New World. These phenomena seem to have far more in common with what we know as spook light or orbs than the typical flying saucers reported in the 1940s. From the 40s into the 1960s, sightings and legends began to grow up around phantom lights. Joplin, Missouri is home of the Ozark Spook Light, a mysterious glowing orb that was frequently encountered on back roads late at night. In Marfa, Texas, a near hysteria mounted around the enigmatic illuminations spotted in the forests around Highway 90. Like Brown Mountain, there's even a specific pull-off to head to if you want to catch a glimpse of the mystery lights. Micah Hanks lives near Brown Mountain in the city of Asheville, North Carolina. Micah has made a name for himself in the field by writing for various websites and hosting radio programs about Fortean subjects. He's also spent days and nights combing the forests around Brown Mountain for answers to the mystery of the lights.
So behind us here, Brown Mountain, North Carolina, in the Black Mountain Range, just outside of the Linville Gorge. And off in the distance, you'll see a very flat mountain ridge that tapers off, presumably toward the direction of Boone, North Carolina. And that rounded ridge line marks the end of Brown Mountain. I've camped over there many times over the years, and I'll tell you, it's like any other wilderness. There's nothing really peculiar about that terrain, but this is ground zero for where these lights appear. I mean, people see them, and I've seen some really good photographs from over here in the Linville Gorge, but I've spoken with firefighters, locals, campers, hikers. Most will tell you that where you see the most of this is literal Brown Mountain proper, which is what's right behind us here. And of course, we're at the viewing location. There are a lot of different interpretations of what they might be. I mean, going all the way back to the 1920s when George R. Mansfield comes up here with USGS and he does his survey from over on Ginger Cake Mountain, his idea was that it had been oncoming lights from locomotives way off down toward Lenore and off in the distance. But the problem with that theory is that there are a lot of photographs that I think are credible photos from over the years that show these things coming up over the ridgeline and into the air, which railroad lights don't do. I mean, even counting in, things like atmospheric refraction and mirages, that still seems like a kind of a far out explanation for me. Some of these lights do appear to actually be airborne. They're very much like what we'd call ball lightning, which we also can't explain completely. You've got a circumstance where whatever these lights are, they appear and they do so, with remarkable frequency. Enough such that people come up here every weekend looking for these lights. There is one story from right here at the main Brown Mountain Overlook where a man had said years ago, he and his family were up here observing. It had begun to rain slightly just like this. One of the lights comes across the valley. A lot of people have described this, but he said it came close enough that he was able to touch it. Now, maybe that's true, maybe or not, but what he said was that when he touched it, it gave him a good jolt, like an electrical shock, which would be consistent with some sort of electrical phenomena. But the question then is, what kind of mechanism allows for that kind of an energetic presence to form? But I think I've heard more stories, though, where right after a heavy rain, they tend to appear. And I think that if we were to speculate as to why that might be, it's probably because a good rainstorm is going to cause an ionization of the atmosphere that charges, again, the atmosphere, and it's going to be conducive to plasma formation, hypothetically. But if that's the case, that doesn't explain the entire phenomenon.
Greg Cannon is a paranormal investigator with a military background who lives in Marion, North Carolina, just down the road from Brown Mountain. Having grown up in the area, Greg was vaguely aware of the Brown Mountain lights, but it wasn't until recent years that he began looking into the subject for himself.
We always heard stories, or I always heard stories from my cousins and my parents and family about, Brown Mountain lights. The phenomenon didn't really mean a whole lot to me when I was a little kid. As I got a little older, I wanted to go check them out and kind of see what the Brown Mountain lights were all about. So when we moved back to Marion and got settled in, we started trying to go see the Brown Mountain lights. We actually met some people who would go see them all the time, and it wasn't a matter of timing necessarily. It was sort of like The environmental conditions had to be right. You need to have a period of wetness, like rain for 2 to 3 days, and then once it sort of dried for a day or two, if there was a 30-degree shift in temperature roughly, you could go and actually see the Brown Mountain Lights. And that's what we did, and we showed up, we went to the pull-off area. We actually pulled off, and we went and stood by a bunch of people, and brought a bunch of camera gear because we were gonna take pictures and document it. Had no luck, so actually went back to the vehicle and dropped our camera gear off, started to kind of shut things down a little bit, and there was a nice couple standing in front of our van, and they said, "Are you here to see the Brown Mountain Lights?" I said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "Well, you're looking the wrong way." So we turned and looked the opposite direction, and there they were, just whizzing around. It's kind of a strange movement that they were making, and to me it reminded me like an ember that comes off of like a fire. So if you're out there and you're doing a campfire and you get the embers flying around, except they would just kind of float and fly around and then just whiz off to another direction and come back again, or so it's like it had intent and purpose behind it, and that's what really sort of freaked me out. And some would just fly by pretty fast. I've seen about 11 altogether. They were different colors. It was more like phosphorescent colors, phosphorescent yellow you'd see, sometimes orange, and the blue. And that's what I was seeing. And they were about the size of a basketball. And from our vantage point, you're about 5 or 6 miles away. So to see something the size of a basketball had to be really large. And my wife was trying to take pictures, and she stayed at it trying to take pictures and had no luck. I just put everything away and just started watching them through binoculars. It was pretty impressive.
The similarities between traditional flying saucer reports and those of UAP-like orbs and mystery lights are more apparent the further you delve into the topic. While there are a number of nuts and bolts craft descriptions, there are just as many reports of simply strange lights in the sky, and often the behavior of these lights seem to mirror those of phenomena like the one you'll find at Brown Mountain. One of the strangest observations by witnesses of both UFOs and mystery lights is that so often they claim that the object or illumination was being intelligently controlled by something. While the Joplin spook light might seem to be little more than a ghost story, it's been observed by numerous people over the course of decades, and its behavior has never changed. The same can be said for any number of odd luminescent objects or beings seen over the centuries. While on the surface, phantom lights and traditional UFOs might seem to have nothing in common, these rarities do actually inform one another and possibly even offer insight into one another. Certainly, if nothing else, opening the door to examining folklore in a new context.
But I think the one thing that seems to characterize the spook light phenomena, which the whole idea of the spook light or the ghost light seems to be very North American, is the idea that there is an intelligence to the light itself, and that it seems to want to and even delight in interacting with human beings. In some cases, the description is even given of that light seeming to dance with a participant, so that there is this interaction. And it's not just a random bolt of lightning, for example, but it's a form of light that seems to recognize when it's being observed and respond to that in some way.
Within ufology, there's a lot of different theories as to, what is the unifying phenomena at work with a lot of the different paranormal stuff that's going on. Perhaps there is something in the environment. Perhaps there are locales where the environment, the conditions, perhaps in the electromagnetic fields, perhaps in the mineral content, that allows for these things to occur. Maybe they're natural, maybe there's some sort of quantum or even metaphysical thing going on where maybe these things are real and they come from a different reality, a different dimension, a different realm, and from time to time these things can kind of cross boundaries.
Why has there been this change in the terminology from UFO to UAP, and what does that relate to? Is that just because of all the lights in the sky, like the orbs and all that, so it can encompass everything? Or
if we go back to when the term UFO was actually created, it was created by the Air Force. They were the ones who called it unidentified flying objects. And that's because of the high strangeness that was being reported by the public. You know, they were seeing the weirdest stuff in the skies, and the government and the US Air Force had no explanation for it. So when they decided to finally investigate these things, they created the acronym UFO. And this was to downplay the more weirder aspects to all this. It's just an object in the sky that's unidentified. Don't worry, we got this, we'll identify it eventually. I think as the years have gone on and the phenomenon has evolved as well and become possibly more elusive and possibly much weirder, the term UAP is a lot more, I think, appropriate. It encompasses a lot more than just a solid object in the sky. I didn't see a solid object in the sky. I saw weird lights in a triangular formation. So for me, that's an aerial phenomenon. It's not a UFO.
A lot of investigators now within ufology are looking at spook lights. Mostly they're looking at spook lights because they are localized and they are frequent and they are constant. And you can set up equipment, you can monitor a location for a long period of time and attempt to document the anomaly and try to figure out the causation. Unlike, say a flying saucer sighting, which, comes and goes.
If we haven't figured out what the hell UFOs are in the past 70 years, it's time to look at it with a new lens. Change the vocabulary if you have to. Whatever is gonna make us find answers and ask new questions of the phenomenon, I think is important.
So when UFOs sort of arrive on the cultural scene by the late 1940s, 50s, and they're rising to prominence in that period through the 50s and 60s, popular magazine articles began to depict the Brown Mountain Lights as the Brown Mountain UFOs. But prior to that, again, if they were anything other than prosaic misidentification of things, or maybe some kind of unidentified natural phenomena, if anything, they were called ghost lights. Now, I will say this, a friend recently brought to my attention something. She'd been listening to my podcast, and she had heard me on the show say that there were no Native American legends that recount stories of the Brown Mountain Lights, even though by the 1950s and 60s, popular articles began to say that Native American legends among the Cherokee tell of the Brown Mountain Lights. And so I'd mentioned that. She said, actually, I found something that you'll find interesting. And there was an account given by James Mooney, the anthropologist who truly chronicled the myths of the Cherokee here of Western North Carolina. The story talked about, this was sort of almost like a cosmological story about the origin of stars, is what it was. But the way it describes the stars, it tells that a couple of people had seen these two lights moving across the mountain up in the sky above the mountain ridge one night. And so they say they go up on the mountain and they find these two furry creatures with faces kind of like ducks protruding out of it. And they take a couple of them back to their camp, and they say that these creatures, stayed with them by daytime, but that they glowed at night, and that finally they let them go, and that when they did, they rose back up into the heavens and became stars. And so this was a myth, clearly describing where stars come from. The way it described the stars moving over the ridge line, it very least implied that there could have been at some time some sort of an observation of something, which again, in prehistoric times, if that indeed is where the legend comes from, I mean, this would have to entail something moving through the sky that clearly isn't a star. Other celestial phenomena like meteors or comets might not be ruled out completely, but at very least the way that it was described in that legend, it was suggestive of sort of how the Brown Mountain Lights appear at times.
Like most of my journey so far, I didn't manage to actually see the Brown Mountain Lights for myself. Despite the weather conditions being essentially perfect, this phenomenon just didn't feel like coming out to visit with us. Even this far into my trek across the US in search of answers, I'm reminded again that you can't simply walk out your front door and encounter the unknown. Places like Brown Mountain seem to serve as little more than further proof that simply trying to find the pieces, let alone assemble them, is going to be the most difficult part of the puzzle of ufology. Coming up on the next episode of On the Trail of UFOs.
It's one of those things where it's like, you always look back and you're like, Did it really happen? Was it real?
But one morning I woke up and there was dried blood coming out of my nose. Scoops in the back of my neck here.
I've avoided looking too deeply into the abduction side of the subject, maybe because deep down, I'm aware there's something so primal and terrifying about it.